Right. Namaskar and a very warm welcome to everyone joined in today on our 59th Know Your Species, Know Your Zoo talk. This talk is being organized by the Central Zoo Authority, New Delhi, as part of the ongoing Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. The Mahotsav is a 75-week-long celebration to commemorate 75 years of India's independence, which falls on the 15th of August 2022. The Central Zoo Authority is taking the celebration forward through a massive outreach campaign entitled Conservation to Coexistence, The People Connect. Under the helm of this campaign, we will be showcasing 75 conservation priority species and 75 zoos, highlighting one species and one zoo each week. We are currently in week 59 of the celebration with the Western Tragopan as the species in focus and the Sarahan Pheasantry as the zoo in focus. To join in today to speak to us on the species is Mr. Lakshmi Narasimha R, who is the scientific officer at the Central Zoo Authority. Mr. Narasimha is a zoologist by training and has worked in the field of ex situ conservation and research for over a decade. He has been closely associated with developing management protocols for select pheasant species in Himachal Pradesh. He has also worked on the ex situ conservation, breeding, and reintroduction of the species in focus for this week, which is the Western Tragopan, before joining the Central Zoo Authority. He will speak today with us on the species in focus. So over to you.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, Narasimha, audible.
I switched. Please.
It's loading.
One second. Sorry about this.
No problem.
I think there's an issue with the internet.
Would you like for us to come back to the zoo presentation, to the species presentation in case it's taking a bit of time?
I'm sorry, I did not hear that.
I said, if it's taking a bit of time, would you like me to proceed with the zoo presentation first and then come back?
Yeah, just give me 10 more seconds if
Okay,
when
fine. All right.
now. Yeah, is it working now?
Yes, we have a slide which
Yeah.
says Western
Okay.
Tragopan, so I think you're set. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Arundhati. I'm so sorry about this small glitch. So yeah, I'm quite excited about today's talk because it's one of my favorite species. I have spent last part of my life trying to understand this particular species, and given that it is the focus for today, it is I mean, it's a pleasure to talk about this particular species. So I have so Tragopan, Western Tragopan is before we talk about the species, it has remained one of the most least known birds. So I have structured my presentation in form of several questions, which I'll try to answer over the course of my presentation, which by the end of which we should probably have a better understanding of what the species is. These are all the questions that I will try to answer. Starting with the first one, what's actually a tragopan? So Tragopan is basically a pheasant. It's a type of pheasant. Pheasants are large-bodied ground-dwelling birds, basically. So that's a category of birds. Mostly their habits are ground-dwelling and they are ground nesters. The origin of the word as such is Phasianos. It's a Greek word which means that these were birds that were common around the river called as phases. So that's why it's called a pheasant. And if you look at what Tragopan as such means, Tragopan is actually a combination of two words. One is tragus, that is goat. Maybe over the course of my presentation, you'll see why it's called why there is a reference of goat in a bird name. And then Pan is the Greek god of mountains and shepherds because it's a bird which is found in the higher altitude mountains. So that's why it's called Tragopan. So that's the kind of the word etymology of. So, like I said, Tragopan as such is basically a type of pheasant which is placed in the order Galliforms, that is ground-dwelling birds, like I mentioned. There are over 50 species of pheasants that are found across the world, of which 17 pheasants are found in India. Quite brightly colored birds, and most of the species that are found in India are distributed in the Himalayas. And if you look at the conservation status of these birds, there are quite a number of species that are in the vulnerable, near threatened, and endangered categories. So now if you look at, so there are more than 50 species. Now looking at the genus Tragopan itself, so there are actually 5 species of Tragopan across the world. So 4 of which occur in India, as we can see in this map. One species, that is the Cabot Tragopan, that is on the extreme right. That is found in the China in the Chinese region. So the other 4 species are found across the Himalayan gradient, starting from the Western Himalaya until the Eastern Himalaya. 4 species. So the focus for today is the Western Tragopan. So we know why it is called a Tragopan, but why it's called the Western Tragopan? Because it is a species that is endemic to the Western Himalayas. As you can see from this map, the species is distributed only in the western part of the Himalayan region. So which is why the name Western Tragopan for the species. Well, like I said, it's one of the oldest oldest description of the species available. This is the call of the bird. So it was given by William Beebe. He refers to the bird as a bird which has a plumage which seems like it is a shower of silvery stars. So as you can see in this photograph, if you see the male individual, this is a photograph of a captive bird. There are very few images that are actually taken in the wild, given its rarity. So if you see the image of this bird, you can see why it is called so a shower of silvery stars. And as you can, as you heard the call of this bird, it has a very unique call. The call, what you just heard, was the breeding call of a male, which kind of resembles a bleating call of a goat. That is the origin of the term Tragopan. Again, linking back to why the goat is there in the word Tragopan. So this is one of the first descriptions of the bird, and I think it still remains one of the finest natural history accounts of this particular species available. William Beebe in his monograph on pheasants, written in the early 19th century. So as such, the species, like most pheasants, they are sexually dimorphic, which means that males and females, they look completely different. I mean, by seeing, you can make out, okay, this is the male bird, this is the female bird. What you see on your left is the male bird, on the right is the male, on the right is the female bird. Male bird is very brightly colored. Female has a brownish kind of a drab colored plumage. Just quickly to tell about a few highlights. So it is also the state bird of Himachal Pradesh in India. So it is a flagship species, meaning it is identified. Given how beautiful the bird is, the species is often related and used as a mascot in conservation initiatives across the state. And the one in the center is a chick. So most of the photographs that I've used in this presentation is from a zoo, about which my following talk will give more details about. So having known about the species a bit, so where exactly are they found? Like I mentioned, they are found in the Western Himalaya. But Western Himalaya is a large region, but this particular species is extremely fragmented distributed. As you can see in this image, it is actually much fragmented, far more fragmented. The distribution is far more fragmented than what is depicted here. But broadly, if you look at where exactly they are found, so they are found starting from northern Pakistan and in the Kashmir region, and then Himachal Pradesh and possibly Uttarakhand. Uttarakhand is like there hasn't been any recent reports of this particular species been reported there. But Himachal Pradesh, Kashmir, and northern Pakistan still remains a stronghold for this particular species. But this is where they are found across the world. There is no other place in the world where they are found. So basically, in a very small region and very patchily distributed. That's about the species. So within this particular distributional zone, they are restricted in the higher altitudes of the Western Himalaya. That is, they live between an elevation range between 2,200 to 3,500 meters, say plus or minus 100, 200 meters. Occasional records and sporadic records, but broadly, the summers, they are somewhere near the tree line. That is where they spend the spring months, that is starting from, say, April to June, July, somewhere near the tree line, which is at an elevation between 2,700 to 3,500 meters. This is the elevation during which, during the breeding season, they spend, they are mostly found in this elevation. And in winters, when there is heavy snow, they kind of demonstrate or show local altitudinal movements, and then they move to lower elevations, say up to 2,200 or 2,500 meters, where they kind of escape from the heavy snow in the higher reaches. So they locally move, but broadly, from what is known, it is hypothesized that these species, they don't move far off, and in winters they tend to stay very closer to their breeding grounds. They nevertheless descend down, but they are somewhere closer to the breeding grounds, these individuals. So this is where this is the elevational distribution of this particular species. Now, okay, so we know that they live in the Western Himalaya, and then we know what elevation they live, but what exactly the habitat looks like. So this is this is what the habitat of the bird looks like. It is like I mentioned, it's very close to the tree line. So you can see that there's broadly a patch of which you don't find much. You don't see any trees. These are the grassy alpine slopes. Somewhere in the forests below here, this is actually one of the sites in the Amangati Wildlife Sanctuary where the species is actually found. So this is kind of a representative habitat of where the species lives, so dense forests and high altitude forests. If you take a closer look of the forest, what exactly it looks like, so there are if you look at the tree species broadly, it is oak, that is brown oak, Quercus semicardifolia, and then along with it there are birch trees, maple, and fir trees, Ebispin rope. So these are the larger tree forms that are found in the habitat of the species, both summer and winter. The tree species, a few additional species might be found in the lower elevation, but broadly the species composition remains the same. In addition to these larger tree species, there is the habitat of the Tragopan is characterized by a very dense understory, as you can see in this image. So there are larger tree forms that give the habitat a very dense canopy cover. But what is even more important is the understory. This is what defines whether the species actually occupies this habitat or not. The understory is mostly of rhododendrons, pink rhododendron at that elevation, and ringal bamboo. There's a species of alpine bamboo that is quite characteristic of this particular habitat, and then a lot of ferns and shrubs, as you can see in this image. So the bird, it's not a species that really readily flies when there is a threat. So the species tends to skulk away. So the habitat it occupies kind of aids in skulking away, in hiding. So this is broadly the composition of the habitat. But if you look at finer habitat characteristics, so it's quite rugged. The species inhabits landscapes which are very, very rugged, very rocky, a lot of crevices. It's not a smooth landscape. It's a topographically complex environment. And also, generally, they tend to show preference for northern slopes. Northern slopes are quite shady, and they remain mostly humid across the year. So that's the preference they show in their distribution across the distribution range. So this is broadly about what kind of habitat they live in, and what the habitat looks like. Now coming to, okay, fine. So they live in a particular habitat, but what are their eating habits? What do they feed on? So generally, if you look at pheasants as a species, most species tend to be largely insectivorous. But Tragopans as a genus, they have a unique dietary specialization wherein they feed mostly on vegetative matter. Insects, they do feed on insects, but it has been found based on crop observations by several authors that they actually consume far less insects as compared to other pheasants, but they predominantly they feed mostly on vegetative matter. Vegetative matter could include, say, flowers, say, buds, acorns from oak trees, berries that are found in the habitat, say the wild strawberries, ferns, ringal bamboo. So mostly vegetative matter. That is what predominates in their diet. But during the breeding season, when there is a requirement for protein for the chicks, so that's when they consume a very small amount of animal protein in the form of insects, maybe. So, but largely, the animal protein part remains largely less in this particular species. So that's about their eating habit. So how do they propagate? So they occupy a particular habitat, and they have particular feeding habits. So now looking at the propagation of this particular species. So they are seasonal breeders. They breed once a year, and their breeding season extends largely from April to July. That is when most of the breeding activities are concentrated in across a year. If you look at the onset of the breeding season, that is somewhere during April, during when there is courtship and egg laying. Well, these observations largely, whatever is presented here, is a combination of both what has been observed in captivity and also in the wild. So April is largely the time of the year when the breeding season sets in, during which there is courtship. One of the first things that is observed in courtship is the call. of the bird. They are quite vocal birds, very early in the morning. They are the first birds to call. So the call which I just played a couple of slides before, that's the call you hear in the habitat of the bird, very early in the morning, say between 3 and 4 in the morning. And then there's a courtship display, elaborate courtship display. I have a video of it in the following slide. And then April is the time also, and by the end of April, they would have selected a nest and started egg laying. May and June is largely the months where egg laying continues, and then there is incubation and hatching also, and which extends till July. So May, June, and July are the months wherein there is very less courtship, as in very few calls being heard in the wild and all. But after mid-May and all, it's mostly the time of the year would be mostly on egg laying, incubation, and hatching. So these are the broad kind of activities that would follow as far as the breeding season of the species is concerned. Like I mentioned, so the species has elaborate courtship display. The color of the bird, the beauty of the bird is kind of quite stunning when you witness display of this particular species. It's not something that has been recorded in the wild again. This is a clipping from breeding center for this particular species. I would just let you all watch this particular display, courtship display of this particular species. So this is called as a frontal display of this particular species. So generally the male initiates the courtship by hiding behind an object. The female is actually in front of the male. As you can see, so that's the kind of the end of the courtship. So over the course of a day, a male, displays to the particular female, a frontal display particular to a female with which it is paired, or in the wild, it's actually a leg system where there would be multiple females to which the male would possibly display to. But basically, the frontal display is exhibited multiple times across a day. It doesn't necessarily mean that every frontal display results in mating, but just only a few of them end up in mating. On the left-hand top is what you see when the lappet and horns are extended of this particular male. That is how it would look. So during the display, you must have noticed that they have. You could see that the male looks like it has got two horns, which is why it was also previously called as the Western horned pheasant. So, like I mentioned, so they are seasonal breeders. One unique behavior of this particular genus is that they are elevated nesters. Most pheasants nest on the ground, except for this particular genus. All the species in the genus Tragopan, that is 5 species which I mentioned, they nest at elevated locations. That is maybe a broken tree trunk or old nest of a corvid. It could be anything, but they don't nest on the ground. And it is the same with Western Tragopan also. It's been nearly a century since anyone has really come across the nest of a Tragopan. It's very rare. Personally, I have not seen and I have not known anyone who has actually come across the nest of this particular bird, except for a few anecdotal records which shepherds have shared. But it's one of the rarest and most elusive birds in its behavior. So there isn't much known about the nesting behavior of this particular bird, but I'm sure that in the following presentation, from what you know about the captive, by keeping these birds in captivity, what we have known about this particular species, Mr. Dharamveer Meena will describe that. So basically, these are elevated nesters, and from what we know about their nesting ecology is that they lay around 3 to 5 eggs. per particular season. And the parental care as such is taken care of entirely by the females. So males have no role in rearing the chicks. So once the hatching occurs, the chicks stay with the mother through the winters. So until the following breeding season, say June or July, the chicks hatch out. The chicks stay with the mother through the winters. That is when they are found in loose groups, and they stay together through the winter, and in the following breeding season they disperse. The chicks disperse from the parents before the adult birds pair up and for the breeding season. And also, it's a very unique behavior. So during the breeding months, these birds are extremely territorial, and during the non-breeding months, they are quite loosely. They form larger groups in which they forage and they stay together. Now, having known about this, these information about this, what is exactly their ecological role? I mean, in an ecosystem, where exactly do they fit in? Like I said, I have very little information about this particular species and what they eat and all from the wild, especially. But from what we know from anecdotal observations, primary observations made by me in the field during field work. So what we know is one of the primary roles of this particular species is the act as seed disperser. What you see in the photograph is a very rare tree. It's a West Himalayan yew, Taxus contata. It is one of the endangered trees of this particular. So they are known to be associated wherever these trees are there. So possibly they have a role in dispersal of seed of this tree. Of course, like I said, they are insectivorous, although not to a great extent, but they are insectivorous birds. And of course, they are also prey for carnivores or predatory birds and animals that inhabit that particular landscape, like for example. So the martin, golden eagle, so they are also prey species. So these are broadly the ecological roles that have been assigned to this particular species. So having known about the ecology of the species, so what is the conservation status of this particular species? What is it that, okay, so we know so little about this particular species, but what is it that, what is their status in the wild? IUCN classifies it as a vulnerable species, which means that they are not like really threatened, but they need conservation attention in terms of taking practical conservation measures to save the species in the wild. The Wildlife Protection Act has placed it in Schedule 1, which accords its the highest protection in the country. BirdLife International, based on secondary information and some field studies, they have put up a global population estimate of fewer than 5,000 individuals. That was a couple of years ago. So this is broadly what we know about this particular species because of their fragmented nature and the habitat they occupy, which is limiting in terms of accessibility. You going there, carrying out surveys. So there are very few studies that are actually being taken up to study the population status of the species. But whatever is known, there are fewer than. So roughly, it's put somewhere between 3,000 to 5,000 the global population. But again, most of the populations are fragmented and they are distributed in small patches, so which puts them at a very high risk of local extinctions. So now, given that there are so few individuals left in the wild, what are the key conservation issues faced by this species? One of the key things for this particular species is, like I mentioned before, it's a habitat specialist. It has very unique habitat requirements in order to thrive and breed in a particular place. If there is disturbances by humans, reduction in the quality of the habitat will lead to the species not inhabiting a particular region. So habitat disturbances and habitat loss is one of the largest and the greatest threats for this particular species in terms of why they are reducing or going extinct across their distribution range. Habitat loss could be high-oil projects, or it can't be as such development, but it is a cascading effect of hydroelectric projects in the lower elevations. Medicinal plant collection is a proximate threat for this particular species. Unfortunately, for this particular species, they inhabit one of the most remotest forests in the world, but the forests are teeming with medicinal herbs herbs which have been assigned medicinal value by humans. So people go there to collect these medicinal plants, and unfortunately, most of these herbs sprout during the breeding season. That is when April to June, and that's when a lot of people go into the forest in search of these herbs, which causes a lot of disturbance, and that indirectly affects this particular species. Grazing is another threat. So generally grazing happens in the alpine pastures, but unfortunately for the species again, so they'll live in the path of the movement of sheep. So during the months of April, May, June, shepherds move with their sheep to the alpine pastures, and it kind of coincides with the breeding season of this particular species when they move with their sheep into the forest to the alpine pastures. So it is just that an unfortunate coincidence that the movement of the sheep and the breeding season of these birds kind of overlap, and that causes a lot of trampling of vegetation, loss of disturbance in the habitat, so which indirectly affects hunting. In some parts of its range, it is still reported, but largely it is not like one of the most key threats, but it is still persistent in some parts of its range. Just to give you a picture of what are the key threats. So hunting, like I said, it is still prevalent in some parts of the region, and then on the right top, you can see shepherds with large flocks of sheep moving in the forest. So this kind of tramples the vegetation and degrades the overall quality of the habitat, which is not liked by the species because they have a tendency for very pristine, undisturbed forest. And the bottom two are another key threats. Like I said, medicinal plant collection. These are the two key species which are often people are often behind to collect during the breeding season. On the left is Himalayan trillium. It's called Nagchatri. On the right is it's a model. It's called Gucci. So these two are like one of the most some of the most sought after herbs in the habitat, which are found in the habitat of the species. I mean, of course, there are several others also, but these are broadly the key medicinal plants or NTFPs rather, which people are after in terms of collection. Looking at conservation actions, so state governments across its distributional range, they have set up protected areas to save this particular species. For example, most of the photographs and the information what I presented here is I observed this particular species in one of the sanctuaries in Himachal Pradesh that is called as the Darmangati Wildlife Sanctuary, which is very close to the zoo in focus. So this particular sanctuary is a stronghold of this particular species. So protected areas and also regions outside the protected areas that are important in terms of protection of the species. Like I said, conservation mascots, it's a flagship species for highlighting conservation importance of this particular species. And of course, mapping and protection of habitats. Given that they have a very unique requirement of habitat, there are several studies which kind of look at mapping and identification of habitats across this distribution range, where there can be focused conservation efforts in terms of, okay, what exactly. So we know this region of across its range is key for this particular species. So we have a more intensive management effort in that particular area. And of course, the lastly is ex situ conservation. That is ex situ conservation has led set an example in terms of ex situ conservation of this particular species. By setting up the only conservation breeding center for this species in the world. The program is ongoing at Sarahan Pheasantry, and the follow-up presentation will focus on that. The program is actually part of a larger conservation breeding program run by Central Zoo Authority, which has identified this species as a priority for conservation breeding as well. So to kind of summarize, this largely a lot of the ecology of the species or the biology of the species still remains unknown. We know very less about this particular species, but in order to make sure that we keep seeing this species as happy as it is in this particular graphic, there are swift and very immediate conservation actions required. I mean, of course, there are a lot of actions that have already been initiated, but it has to be more effective and more wild in order to make sure that they continue to survive in the wild and finally also ensure their long-term persistence. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Natsima, for giving a comprehensive overview of the species in focus, along with the conservation action points that need to be taken into consideration. We will take question answers for this session at the end of it. We now move on to our second talk for today's Know Your Species, Know Your Zoo talk, which is on the Sarahan Pheasantry. So joined in today to speak to us on the zoo is Mr. Dharamveer Meena, who is the Deputy Conservator of Forests and the Director of the Sarahan Pheasantry. So Mr. Meena is an Indian Forest Service officer from the Himachal Pradesh cadre, and he has done his graduation from the Indian Institute of Technology, Bombay, and has since worked towards the management of forests and wildlife in Himachal. So he will speak to us more on the Sarahan Pheasantry. So please, sir.
Thank you, Arundhati, and thank you, Nasima, for so detailed elaboration about species Western Tragopan. Very little is actually known about this species, as mentioned by Dr. Nasima, and he very extensively explained about the bird, what are pheasants, its habitat, what is it feeds on, its conservation status. So quite a good background actually provided by him. Uh, so I'll just carry on with my presentation. I'm first of all very excited to join this talk because Sarahan was my first posting, and I have actually worked for a period of around 4 years in the pheasantry. And I'll tell you, when I initially joined, I didn't know what Western Tragopan is, and now I am quite involved in its conservation. Not only conservation, but our whole team is now into the second aspect of the conservation, that is the Western Tragopan reintroduction, which we are doing for the past 2 years. So thank you for calling me, and I'll just share my views and my experiences of working in Sarahan Pheasantry. So we'll start. Actually, a lot has been already explained by Dr. Nasima. So I'll quickly go through the other parts, which needs a bit of elaboration and explanation.
Mr. Meena, can you hear us? We have lost your audio.
Many reasons we are not able to increase the population or conserve the species in its own habitat. For example, the Western Tragopan. So we are bringing it outside, helping to increase its population by conservation breeding. And once the population attains a feasible size, then finally the aim is to release back into the wild. So that is why we need conservation breeding actually. Already explained by Dr. Nasima, just one slide which says that there are 7 species of pheasants in Himachal Pradesh. Western Tragopan has already been mentioned, and we have Himalayan monal, which is also a state bird of Uttarakhand. Cheer pheasant is another pheasant species which Himachal is undertaking.
I think Mr. Meena is having a bit of a difficulty in connecting with the audio, so we'll just give him a minute to rejoin back on this.
The name Tragopan came and emerged. Locally, the Tragopan is known as
So,
Jujurana. Uh,
sorry to interrupt. Your voice is breaking off in between, so there was a bit of a lag from your last slide to this. If you could just recapitulate it fast in, say, 15,
okay, I'll
20
go back to
seconds. Yeah.
the last slide.
Yes, yes.
So I was telling that these are the 5 species of Tragopan found in the world, and out of these 5, 4 are in India. Apart from the first species, which is Cabot Tragopan, it is found in China. And all 4 are located in India, mainly extending from western to eastern Himalayas. And there are details given below. Western Tragopan, its conservation breeding is taking place in Sarahan, I already mentioned. While Black Tragopan conservation breeding program is going on in Kohima, Nagaland, and Satire Tragopan in Darjeeling. So these are the photographs which our team has taken in the breeding center at Sarahan. On the left side, you see where the species is endemic to. That is, it extends from Western Himalaya in India and some parts of Pakistan also. The Western Tragopan, we all know it by the name of Western Tragopan, but locally people call it with different names. There are some local names and those also varies. For example, in Himachal, you will know it by the name of Jujurana. So Jujurana literally means king of birds. And because it is such a rare species and also it has very cultural significance also. And that's why its name is Jujurana. And in other areas, there are some other names like Fulgar, Pyara. These are the various names by which the Western Tragopan is known across Himachal Pradesh. So here already it is explained that what a typical habitat of a Western Tragopan comprises of and its habitat range. But what is important in this slide is uh, the photograph of a Tragopan in its natural habitat, because it's such a rare and elusive bird that it's very difficult to sight it in the wild, and this image is also a camera trap image. So that has been captured by our team and it is from the Dharangati Wildlife Sanctuary. We already mentioned about its habitat, that it is found at an altitude between 2600 2500 meters to uh, till the tree line, and it's a seasonal migrant. In winter it descends a bit downwards, whereas in spring summers it moves to higher elevations. And we call it as an habitat specialist because of its typical requirement of habitat, and that is the main reason why it is a threatened species. Various studies have shown its population to be around 3000 to some studies have mentioned that around 2500 birds are present all over the world. So when we talk of Tragopan, uh, it is not poaching or other threats which has played a role in its extinction or not extinction, but in declining population. But main is the habitat disturbances, because being a very uh, sensitive to habitat requirements, even smaller disturbances like livestock, minor food collection, product collection can lead to the loss of habitat. And it's uh, categorized as vulnerable by the IUCN. This slide, I think we already seen. These are the male Tragopan, the female Tragopan, and a juvenile Tragopan we can see in the picture. So now coming on to the Sarahan Pheasantry. This is the Sarahan Pheasantry is located in the district of Shimla, and the Pheasantry is located at an altitude of around 2300 meters. This is the entry gate of the Pheasantry. It is a picture taken during December, January when snowfall is there. The Pheasantry is located adjacent to the Dharangati Wildlife Sanctuary, where we can find the tragopans in the wild. Coming on to how a bit of history about the Sarahan Pheasantry. It started in 1980s as a rescue center where wild rescued species of animals and birds were kept. Then in 1993, the first breeding of the species was reported in 1993. In 2003-4, the CZA approved the conservation breeding project of the Western Tragopan. And in 2007, the CZA included the Tragopan in the priority list of species identified for conservation breeding. And in the same year, it was declared as a state bird of Himachal Pradesh. Earlier, it was Himalayan monal. So in 2007, the state government changed it to Western Tragopan. And one landmark achievement in the conservation breeding program started in 2020 when we had a significant population of the species in the zoo. So the next step is the reintroduction program. So in 2020, the first phase of the reintroduction program was started, which is still going on. Talking about the various management aspects we have undertaken at the Conservation Breeding Center, because it's a very sensitive species, even minor interventions can have many impacts on its breeding and conservation. For example, we'll briefly talk about the enclosures, designs, feeding regime, the monitoring, the breeding, and the artificial incubation activities which we are having in our pheasantry. This is the display enclosure. So the aim of the pheasantry is the conservation of the species, but we also have visitors and tourists. So we have a very small section which is open for visitors, and here the non-breeding pairs of the tragopans are kept. Apart from the tragopan, we have other pheasants like the monal and cullige also. These are the enclosures. The enclosures are technically verified by CZA also, and these designs are kept keeping in mind the altitude and the weather fluctuation, the heavy snowfall, and the requirement of the species also. We have a night shelter in it and enough space for the bird to roam around so that it mimics as much as the natural habitat of the species. Some of the signage displays which we have in the pheasantry, these signages are for enrichment of the visitors. We have all the, as you can see on the left side, all the important pheasants of Himachal Pradesh. On the right side, we can see the overall details about the pheasantry, other species, and other signages of the various bird species found in the pheasantry. Already, as described by Dr. Nasimha, and that the Western Tragopan is a frugivorous, that its main diet comprises of fruits and vegetative parts. So we are very specific about the diet because it plays a crucial role in its breeding and conservation. And the diet is specially designed to supply various nutrients and its requirements. Usually, we have only limited number of people who have access to the tragopans, and so that the tragopans don't get much habituated to the humans. So this is the diet which we supply in the morning at around 6 o'clock, and depending on the season also 6 to 7, in winters a bit late. And this is a broad pictures. You can see what the diet comprises of. We have some local grown vegetative matter, and we also bring other fruits from outside also. This is again the various protein diet which we provide to the Western tragopans. We have an inbuilt poly house where locally we grow some vegetables and fruits. So these are the inside picture of the enclosures. We know that the Western tragopans are elevated nesters as compared to other pheasant species. So, though nobody has seen the nest, but overall it is broadly understood in the scientific community that these species are elevated nesters. So that's why we provide them nests at an elevation inside the enclosures. So when the pheasantry initially started, maybe in the early 2000 or late 1990s, the eggs were put on the ground surface and the breeding was not very successful. But after 2010, we started developing elevated nesters, and we could see a very significant improvement in overall breeding progress. So that's how we provide 2-3 nesting options to the birds during the breeding season. and depending on the female, we actually provide an option. She can choose a nest as per her choice, and this has actually increased our breeding success. These are the various photos of nest as shown in the picture. So from April onwards, the breeding season actually starts in Western Tragopan. So this is the time when actually the mating calls and courtship display starts. And before all this, we need to do certain preparation. For example, pairing of the birds. So we pair the birds keeping in mind the genetic suitability, so that to avoid and minimize the inbreeding issue. So all the pairing part has to be done before April only. So this is just one video where the pairing and release of the bird is being done. Keeping in mind the sensitive nature of the birds, we try to minimize the human disturbances, and that's why we monitor all the bird movements in all the enclosures through CCTV cameras, and only when required do we go inside the enclosures to for any intervention which are required. Usually, CCTV is what we monitor through. Another video of a tragopan inside an enclosure. And this is the female. We know that Western Tragopan are dimorphic in nature, and that is the males are the brightly colored and the female are slightly dull in nature, brownish shade they have. Moving ahead. So this is a broad chronology of the breeding activities. In April, the vocalization, display, and starts, and it continues till the month of July. Eggling mainly happens in late April or May, and till June, July, we have the final hatching of the eggs also. We have already seen a very wonderful video of the courtship display. This is one picture displaying the frontal display of the tragopan during the courtship display and the fleshy horns. One more video of the courtship display. As described by Dr. Nasiman, that the tragopans courtship display, usually they hide behind some blocks or wooden blocks. So we can observe that also in this. It's a very unique display, and it has been observed only in captivity. In the wild, no such observations have been there till now. Apart from natural breeding, we also have a incubator-based hatching, because what happens is mainly during the breeding time, the clutch size of of this species around 3 to 5 eggs. Sometimes eggs are abundant because of various reasons, and since every egg is quite precious for us, we uh, use the incubator to hatch those eggs. And in the picture top, you can see hatched juveniles inside the incubator. So over the period of past 3-4 years, we have been trying this and reasonably successful. This is quite a good achievement on the part of the Pheasantry, keeping the mm, species in mind. These are again the different incubators and brooding enclosures which we use for the incubators. This slide shows the population of the captive in captivity we have of this species. Even after 20-25 years, we can see that the population is around 44, 44 to 50. So we understand how difficult the breeding uh, of the species is, and but over a period of last 5-6 years, we can say that as the table shows, we have had significant achievement in terms of breeding. So our team at the breeding center is now quite quite good in this aspect, and we have developed certain standard procedures and methods to go ahead with the breeding. So this we can say that quite and the Himachal Pradesh Forest Department has been a pioneer in especially the breeding program of pheasants. Uh, so in year 2019, we developed a new pheasantry. It was actually made functional in 2019, keeping in view that the stock, it's not actually safe to keep our full stock in one facility. This alternate facility is located at an altitude, and it is at a more natural place and less disturbances there. So those stocks which we choose for reintroduction programs, so those are shifted here, and the breedings happen in these enclosures. This is a general slide. These are some of the bird species which we find in our pheasantry. So thank you. I think I have broadly tried to describe the various activities which we have undertaken in the pheasantry and the overall history of how the conservation breeding has evolved over a period of time. Arundhati, over to you.
Yes. Thank you so much, sir, for giving an overview of the Sarahan Pheasantry as well as elucidating on the activities carried out there. We will now move on to the question answer session for today's talk. So, Nasima, the first question for you is that has there been any local migration reported from wildlife for this species during seasonal changes?
I'm sorry, I just lost in between. Has there been any reports of what? You have to unmute yourself, I think, Arundhati. Sorry.
Oops. Is there any local migration, any reports of local migration that the species undertakes during changes in seasons?
Yes. So, like I mentioned, so they during the breeding season, that is during the breeding months between April and June, they are somewhere near the tree line, that is close to 3,500 meters. But in during the winter months, they kind of descend down to lower elevations. I mean, not like really low, but somewhere close to say around 500-600 meters elevations, maybe to more denser forests where they can escape the snow and the winters are relatively less harsh. So that's the kind of local movement the species exhibits.
Right.
And I also think the audio was not working probably during my presentation, right? So I think I might have missed the call of the bird.
Okay.
Can you give me 10 seconds? Should I try it once?
Sure.
I think I think it's an interesting call. I think people
Fine.
should hear that.
Sure. Go ahead.
Let me try that once. Wait. Can you see the screen?
Yes, I can see the screen.
One second.
it's working.
Yeah, that was the call I wanted to play.
All right. So now moving on to the next question for you is that what is the resource partitioning like between the Western Tragopan and other Sympatric species in overlapping ranges?
Okay, so as far as sympatric species are concerned, the other pheasant species that cohabit with the Western Tragopan are the co-class pheasant, Himalayan monal, and also there are some smaller galliforms such as the hill partridges and all. Resource partitioning per se, I won't be able to comment much because there isn't much information available. But based on camera trap observations and based on what I've seen in the field, mostly there is a sort of difference in terms of the time of the day in which during which they are active. So tragopans tend to be quite early, and the monals and co-class pheasants they generally start late. Say for example, if there is a particular camera trap, you can see Western tragopans coming in very early for feeding, and then followed by monal and co-class pheasants. So there's probably sort of difference in terms of when they are active during the day, and that's how they would navigate.
Right. And the next question for you is that are we aware of what the mating system of the species is like in the wild? Are they monogamous or what is the mating system like?
I definitely don't think it's monogamous because there is no shared parental care. Cheer pheasant, on the other hand, has sort of a seasonal monogamy for a particular breeding season they pair. But in case of Western Tragopan, I wouldn't expect a monogamous pairing mating system because the parental care is exclusively taken care of by the females. So there is one reference somewhere. I remember reading that it's sort of a leg system. So I think there would be multiple females in a given area, and there is a male, and then multiple males displaying, and there will be courtship, and then which based on which the pairing happens or mate selection happens.
All right. And the next question for you is that if anthropogenic threats seem to be the most prime causes of, their decrease in numbers, do you think that more protected areas or conservation reserves should be a priority for the management of the species in situ?
Well, as far as the conservation perspective is concerned, I think it is now increasingly clear that exclusively protected areas per se, it's not like okay, that is the go-to solution for conservation of species. Well, protected areas have their own role in terms of protection of habitat and making sure that a particular habitat is preserved. But there are also important landscapes and habitats outside protected areas that also needs to be conserved. So it's not about just say delineating a particular area as a protected area. I think what is of prime importance is to really identify which are the key areas, whether inside protected area or outside protected area, within the distribution range of the species, and then the local forest departments could really intensify their efforts towards the conservation of these areas. I think that's more of a pragmatic approach towards conservation of the species.
Right. And the last question for you is, which I think Mr. Meena can also answer. I mean, either of you can. It says that the estimated population of Western Tragopan is less than 5,000 in wild. Has there been any annual census of these? Are there any annual census for these birds in place within the home range? And if so, when was the last census conducted and what was the count? If that can be answered.
Okay. So basically, so the global estimates that the BirdLife has put forward is basically collated from various field biologists who are familiar with the species or are working with the particular species to sort of get a conservative estimate of how many individuals are there in the wild. It is not entirely drawn based on field studies. It's not that across the distribution range, people have gone and done like census, and then based on that, the number. It's just a sort of a conservative estimate of what is the picture in the wild. And as far as counting these individuals goes, like I said, if you look at the habitat of the bird, really counting per se might not be a very feasible, might not be feasible actually. It's quite challenging, and also the time period available for taking up census and all is very limited. So that's only the seasons, only for example, the breeding months are the time when you can actually access the habitat. During winters, they are completely, you just cannot access the habitat. So given all these factors, I think broadly, largely what studies are focusing on now is occupancy-based studies. Given the extensive landscape that the species inhabits, what percentage of the landscape is actually used by the species? In the sense, what percentage of the landscape is actually occupied by the species currently, and how it has changed over time, monitoring that over time. That has come up as a very interesting approach towards monitoring the species. Annual censuses, I am not aware of any such exercise for this particular species.
All right, so those were the questions for you. We now move on to questions for Mr. Meena. So, sir, the first question for you is, what are the management practices that are in place or that are taken into consideration when you have to manage the pheasantry during the winter months?
So winter months are actually quite challenging. If we see the altitude of the zoo at around 2,300 meters, so it's completely snow covered. But one thing is we don't need to take care of it is about the birds, because the birds are already habituated to such a low temperature, low temperatures. So in the enclosures, we have both facility. We have a night shed also and open space also. So accordingly, bird can change places depending on their requirements. Plus, we need to alter a bit about their feeding timings, because usually we provide all the feed to them early in the morning at around 6. But keeping the winters in mind, we shift it to around 7 to or 8 o'clock. These are the broad things which we take care of.
Right, sir. And the next question for you is that what are the steps that are followed for reintroduction of the species?
So reintroduction, we are carrying out since 2020, and this year will be the third phase. In 2020 was our first phase. In 2021 again, we undertook the reintroduction, which is still ongoing. So reintroduction has a set of guidelines, broad guidelines as suggested by IUCN also. So usually some major components I'll highlight what needs to be taken care of in reintroduction. First is the reintroduction site, where the site has to be located. So if we see its habitat is around 2,500 meters, so the site has to be very mimic that habitat, and also the disturbance has to be minimized. So we have chosen Dharangati Wildlife Sanctuary. Being a protected area, the disturbances are very minimal. So that is one thing. Then we need to do a predator analysis. What are the main threats which the species faces in that habitat? And we need to minimize it as much as possible. Not by removing predators, but by other measures, monitoring and safeguarding them, designing the enclosures in such a way that the predators are not able to harm the birds which are shifted there. Then we need to finalize on the family groups which we are releasing for the reintroduction, because as per IUCN, we can only release the family groups. We don't release individuals. So around 2 families per year we are releasing in the wild. Then one other thing is the soft release part of the reintroduction. Like before the final release into the wild, we shift them into the soft pens designed at the reintroduction site. So we keep those birds for around 3 weeks, and when they are habituated to their surroundings, acclimatized to the climatic conditions, then we finally release them. And apart from that, we have a very good. We need to have a very good set of monitoring thing, because once the birds are released, the success or failure of a program can be only decided once we are able to monitor the birds. So we have specially tags called VHF based GPS tags, So by them, we are able to know the exact location where the birds are moving and tell how they are behaving in the wild. So these are the main things which we keep in mind while the reintroduction.
Right, sir. And I think in this question, in the response to this question, you also answered the next question, which was what are the post-release protocols in place? So these were the questions for you, sir. And with this, we come to an end for our 59th Know Your Species, Know Your Zoo Talk. So on behalf of the Central Zoo Authority, I would like to thank both the speakers, Mr. Narasimha and to Mr. Meena, for taking time out of your schedule and joining us for this talk. And I would also like to thank the audience who have been with us throughout this talk. And would also like to inform them that we'll be back next week with our week 60 talk, which is on the Bharal and the Himalayan Zoological Park Sikkim. So do tune in for that talk next Wednesday from 4 to 5 p.m. And once again, thank you so much for joining in. Namaskar.
Thank you, Arundhati. Thank you.
Thanks, Arundhati. Thank you so much.